All right, so now we have our picture that's out of focus. We have our picture that's in focus. We've seen that we can take focus away from our picture that's in focus in Photoshop in various ways using either a Gaussian blur or a motion blur to match doing those same things optically with our lens. But now we're going to see some of the other things we can play with in Photoshop that go beyond the scope of what you can do in a darkroom, and therefore kind of go beyond photography. So I'm not worried about making them match anymore. I'm worried about just making pure, beautiful visual art and seeing the photograph as a painting on the wall more than an image that conveys any specific content. And so the way I can do that is, always make a duplicate first. So I've made a duplicate using Command J. And we're going to explore some of the adjustments. So just like we did with our contrast and texture projects, you can play with the levels and you can adjust the levels of lights and darks. I'll optimize the contrast here. And I can take the midtones darker or lighter. Pretty happy with close to the middle. Okay. And then I can make another duplicate and I can play with the color just like we did when we were doing the monochrome studies. But instead of taking all the color away, which makes this much less interesting, I can play with the color in other ways. I can push the saturation even more intense if I want to. If I do it all the way, it will just make every pixel as saturated as possible, which leads to some pretty jarring images. But maybe I just want to goose the saturation a little bit. Now, what if I want to do it to just one color, like the reds? Well, then I can go to this drop-down menu where it says Master, and I can just select one of the color families. So the reds, and I'm going to goose that saturation a little bit, and maybe the cyans, goose that saturation a little bit. Maybe the blues, bring that out a little bit. Maybe the greens. Maybe I want the yellows to be really desaturated, where the other colors are really coming through. Right? So when I'm happy with how I've played with the color, you can compare it with your original. That was my exposure, that's with levels, that's with playing with the colors. And then we can go to filters. Right? I can blur it more. I can go to Gaussian blur and I can take it down just a little bit more, because sometimes those bright colors, they leave me with a lot of graininess, especially in there. So if I use Gaussian blur a little bit, I can take the edge off of some of that. But this is still fairly photographic. This is all stuff I could conceptually do in a darkroom still with my original exposure. But now let's go beyond what you can do in the darkroom. And when we get to filters beyond blur, which just takes away focus, then we start to get into things that are very different. And to really open up all of those, it's easy to go to the filter gallery. So actually, let me make a duplicate first before I do that. And then I'm going to go to Filter, Filter Gallery. And in this preview window, I'm going to use the minus sign to make sure I can see the image clearly on my screen, so I know what I'm doing to it. And then just like a transform window, all of this preview is just temporary until I hit OK. So you can also type in a value. So I'm going to do about 20%. Or fit in view. There we go. So under artistic, you can change your photo into various media. But the problem with these, they can take a while to process, is that this is the idea of someone at Photoshop, finding the edges, making film grain, doing it with pastels, doing it with a sponge. And this is all stuff that's not really possible in a darkroom, so it takes it more into the realm of digital art. And some of my favorite ones to play with are pellet knife, which makes it look like you're shooting through textured glass. And you can play with the individual sliders, give it more softness. Again, they take a little while to process. You'll see the little progress bar on the bottom. But we're really making Photoshop work hard here. Try to give us options we like. One of the most unusual ones is plastic wrap. Right? It really does look like it's wrapped in plastic or glass or something, or wax. And you can make the highlights really strong if you want, or you can make it quite subtle. So I like that. I'll hit OK. I have that now as a layer. And what I love about making these duplicates and building it is that I can also play with the opacity and kind of work between my different decisions. I can even play with blending modes. And I'll show you what I mean now when I do more extreme filters to this next duplicate. So there are several filters that take away color entirely. Filter gallery, let's go. And you'll find those, I'm curious what glass does. Yeah, it's interesting. You'll find those under sketch. So it can take my color picture and turn it into a charcoal sketch. And since mine has so much light in it, it's not being able to find too many darks. One of my favorites is this halftone pattern, which breaks it into a photographic halftone, but notice it's just one color. Or Conte crayon, or pen and ink, or photocopy, which will really posterize it to just highlights and shadows. There's even ones that allow for kind of segmenting of the portions of pixels into something that looks more like stained glass, and it's called stained glass. The soft glow kind of come from it. But there's nothing in this that looks like photography, though it does look really cool. But something I'll often do as a designer is I will get a halftone pattern from something that I've shot, especially something like this that's vague and gradated. I'll play with its settings. I can even play with the type of diffusion it is. And then I will use my blending modes. I could just use opacity, to blend it into my original, but I can also use blending modes. Combined with opacity, and make some interesting graphic textures. And we're making digital art now, just starting with out of focus exposures. I use blending modes with some of these and use opacity. You can get some really interesting effects. Now, the only problem with filters in my eyes is that they're hard to control for your own purposes. It's more just like a playground to mess with. than something that you can really use to create a vision that you have. And so in that way, they're not an ideal art tool. But at the same time, it's great to see the capabilities we have. And as we move on in the course, especially with our next assignment, assignment 3, we are going to learn to use all of the darkroom tools in Photoshop, like dodge and burn, and retouching and clone stamp, in order to really improve our exposures and make them exactly what we envision and exactly what we want them to be. All right, so if this is my final photo, I'm just going to hold down Option and then go to Layer and click on Merge Visible. And by holding down Option, that will merge all of these different lower opacities that I've been playing with all into one layer. And I can just see in one click then what my exposure looked like and then all the stuff I did to it. It's like a California sunset poster crossed with a honeycomb. All right. And now what we're going to do is save that. You actually don't need to flatten it or merge it in order to save it. We're just going to save it as a JPEG, but we're going to give it this name. Your name and then the number 3 as a JPEG to the desktop. I'm going to go ahead and make it a quality of 12 as long as it's not more than 5 megabytes. Then I'm going to go and turn off all my layers, go back to my original out of focus exposure, and I'm going to save that as a JPEG. Save as Carl2, or your name and 2, as a JPEG to the desktop at the highest quality, as long as it's lower than 5 megabytes. Oh, mine's slightly bigger, so I'm going to take it down a little. There we go. And then once those are saved, you can close them. And I want to open up my in-focus exposure, and I'm going to save that as a JPEG as Carl1, your name and 1, to the desktop. All right. Now we're going to upload those into the course photo bucket. And we're going to put them into under exercises. It's the third exercise, intentional focus. We open up to there and we say upload. And then we put all 3 of our exposures in there, 1, 2, and 3. So here I have Carl1, here's Carl2, here's Carl3. So you're putting your in-focus exposure, your out-of-focus exposure, and then your artistically designed and messed with image. And you can title them that way as well, so that they arrange themselves in the right order. And it'll be interesting to see what you all come up with, because we'll arrange them by title. And if you want to see other inspiration, you can always go to past student examples, and you'll see how this was done with various things throughout the class. And that's all there is to it.